On the evening of September the 19th, 1940, in the empty desert 120 miles south of Mersa Matruh in Libya, a 24-year-old Royal Air Force pilot crash-landed his single-seater Gloucester Gladiator biplane in the wrong patch of sand, snapped the undercarriage on a hidden boulder, smashed his face into the gun sight at 60 miles an hour, and lay broken in the cockpit with his nose pulped, his skull fractured, and the petrol tank above his knees beginning to leak. He was 6'6". He was extraordinarily good-looking. He had been in combat once, briefly, the week before. He had crashed because his squadron's intelligence officer had given him the wrong coordinates for a refueling airstrip that did not, in fact, exist. He was 20 hours away from death, 15 miles from the nearest road, and 26 years from being the most beloved children's author in the English-speaking world. His name was Roald Dahl, and he was about to crawl, broken, out of his own burning aeroplane in a strip of desert that would, in some ways, change everything he would ever write. This is the story of how a tall, awkward, half-Norwegian boy from a Cardiff suburb fought his way into the Royal Air Force at the bottom of the war's worst year, crashed his Gladiator into the Sahara on his first solo flight in combat conditions, walked for 6 hours through the dark with a fractured skull to find his own lines, and went on to become both a decorated fighter pilot and, eventually, the storyteller who gave us James and the Giant Peach. Roald Dahl was born on September the 13th, 1916, in Llandaff, a small suburb of Cardiff, in Wales. His parents were both Norwegian. His father, Harold Dahl, was a wealthy shipbroker who had moved to Cardiff in the 1880s to take advantage of the booming coal export trade. Harold was a striking, one-armed, bookish man. He had lost his left arm in a fall from a roof as a teenager, and he had built a small empire chartering Norwegian ships to carry South Welsh coal to Mediterranean ports. He had a beautiful house in Raider, for children from a second marriage, and an obsessive belief that his children would grow up wealthy, well-educated, and Norwegian. Then in 1920, when Roald was 3, Harold died of pneumonia. Sophie, Roald's mother, was 33 years old, pregnant with her 6th child, and now widowed. She refused to return to Norway. She wanted, she said, to raise her children in the country her husband had loved. She took the family income, made the careful financial arrangements, and stayed in Cardiff. Roald was, by all accounts, an absolute terror as a small boy. He filled his sister's shoes with sweet jam. He put dead mice in jars of licorice at the local sweet shop. He was caned, repeatedly, at every boarding school his mother could afford to send him to. He hated boarding school. He hated cricket. He hated discipline. He loved chocolate, his mother, Norway in the summer, and the dark Welsh hills around Llandaff. He finished his schooling at Repton, a famous English public school in Derbyshire, in 1933. He refused to go to university. He told his mother he wanted to travel, see distant places, and work in foreign countries. He took a job with the Shell Oil Company in London, on the understanding that within a few years he would be posted somewhere remote and exotic. He was 19. He was posted in 1938 to Dar es Salaam, in the British colony of Tanganyika, modern Tanzania, in East Africa. He spent 2 years there, selling kerosene to colonial administrators and German settlers, learning Swahili, watching herds of giraffe move across the savannah outside Dar at sunset, hunting in the bush with his colleagues, getting very nearly killed by a black mamba in his bungalow one night, and writing long, lyrical letters home to his mother that have survived in the family archive and now read to anyone familiar with his later work, like the obvious early sketches of the writer he would become. When Britain declared war on Germany in September of 1939, Roald, like every British male of military age in the African colonies, was called up. He was technically too tall for the RAF at 6'6". He barely fit into the cockpit of any combat aircraft of the period, but he wanted to fly. He drove 800 miles from Dar es Salaam to Nairobi, in Kenya, to find an RAF recruiting office. He arrived in November of 1939. He told the recruiter, who was equally tall, that he wanted to be a fighter pilot. The recruiter, after a long, careful look at him, said the RAF would take him, but he would have to fold himself into the cockpit like a piece of origami. He trained in Kenya, then in Iraq on Tiger Moth biplanes and Hawker Hearts. He was a natural pilot, fast, instinctive, with a gift for low-level aerobatics. He graduated from his operational training in August of 1940 and was posted to 80 Squadron, then operating Gloucester Gladiator biplanes in the western desert of Egypt against Italian forces in Libya. The Gladiator was, by 1940, already obsolete. It was the last frontline biplane in RAF service. It was fast for a biplane, about 250 miles an hour at altitude, but it was no match for the modern Italian Macchi C.200 monoplanes it was about to face. The pilots flying it knew, in their bones, that they were flying museum pieces against fighter aircraft a generation ahead of them. The RAF, desperately short of modern Hurricanes for North Africa, had no choice but to send the Gladiators up anyway. Roald arrived at the squadron's forward landing ground at Fuka, in Egypt, on the 8th of September 1940. He flew familiarization patrols for 10 days. He had not yet fired his guns at an enemy aircraft. On the morning of September the 19th, the squadron was ordered to send a single aircraft to a refueling strip, landing ground 84, at a place called El Amaria, deep in the Libyan desert. The strip was supposed to be a wide flat patch of hard sand, marked by a row of empty fuel drums, used by Hurricane squadrons farther west. Roald was assigned the trip. He was given a map. He was given coordinates. He was told the flight would take 90 minutes. The coordinates were wrong. The strip at El Amaria had been moved weeks earlier, after a German Stuka attack had destroyed the original landing ground. The new strip was 40 miles further west. The intelligence officer at 80 Squadron had not been informed. The map Roald was carrying was based on a 6-week-old briefing. By the time he reached the area he had been told to look for, his fuel was running low, the sun was setting, and the empty patch of desert below him was just a featureless waste of sand. He searched for 40 minutes. He did not find the strip. The fuel gauge dropped past empty. The engine began to cough. He made the only choice he had. He tried to put the aircraft down on the smoothest piece of open ground he could see. The boulder he did not see was about 2 feet across. It was buried just under the surface of the sand. The Gladiator's undercarriage struck it at perhaps 60 miles an hour. The wheels were torn off. The propeller dug into the ground. The aircraft cartwheeled. Roald's straps did not hold. His face slammed into the metal gun sight in front of him. The cockpit canopy shattered. When he regained consciousness, he was never able afterward to say how long he had been out. The aircraft was on its back. The petrol tank above his head was leaking onto his flight suit. He could hear nothing. He could see nothing out of his left eye. His nose, by his own touch, was not where it should be. His skull was fractured in 2 places. His back was twisted. He got himself out of the cockpit. He crawled away from the leaking petrol on his stomach. He lay in the sand for some hours, perhaps 4, perhaps 6, before he was able to stand. Then, with his face streaming blood, his left eye completely closed, and his head pounding so hard he could barely see straight with his right, he began to walk. He walked on the basis of where he thought north must be from the sunset he had watched from the cockpit, toward what he hoped were British lines. He was lucky. After perhaps 3 hours of walking, he was spotted by an RAF Bristol-Bombay transport whose pilot, an Australian named Charlie Webb, had been quietly searching for the missing pilot all afternoon. Webb landed his aircraft in the dark on rough ground with no runway against orders, because he had heard that the missing pilot was a particularly tall young man on his first solo desert flight, and he did not want to leave him out there overnight. Roald was loaded onto the Bombay. He was flown to Alexandria. He was admitted, semi-conscious, to the Royal Naval Hospital. The surgeons there found a fractured skull, a fractured spine, a completely crushed nose, severely lacerated forehead, and damage to both eyes. They worked on his nose first. The eye surgery took longer. He spent 6 months in the hospital, undergoing a series of operations and a long, slow recovery of vision in his left eye. He was eventually well enough by March of 1941 to return to flying. By then his old squadron had been re-equipped with Hawker Hurricanes, proper modern monoplanes, 2/3 faster than the old Gladiators, 8 machine guns to the wings. He was posted to 80 Squadron's new operational base in Greece, where the squadron was supporting the British Expeditionary Force against the German invasion of the Balkans. He flew Hurricanes over Greece for 6 weeks. He shot down 5 enemy aircraft, confirmed, making him, by the formal RAF standard, a fighter ace. He was withdrawn from Greece with the rest of his squadron when the German offensive overwhelmed the British position in late April. He was evacuated to Crete, then back to Egypt, then to Palestine, where he flew operational missions until June 1941. By that point, the persistent headaches from his desert crash had returned. He was grounded by the squadron medical officer. He was sent home to Britain on a hospital ship in late summer 1941. He was 25 years old. He had a fractured skull that had not fully healed, a nose that had been rebuilt in 3 operations, vision in his left eye that came and went, and persistent migraines that no medicine in 1941 could properly treat. The RAF gave him a temporary medical discharge from combat flying. What he was given next was, by the bureaucratic standards of the war, very strange. The British Embassy in Washington needed an air attaché who could brief American audiences on the air war in Europe. Someone tall, good-looking, well-spoken, decorated, and capable of charming American senators and journalists in the way only a 6'6", half-Norwegian RAF ace with a fractured skull and a posh accent could. Roald, recovering at his mother's house, was tapped for the job. He arrived in Washington in April of 1942 and was attached to the British Embassy as an assistant air attaché. He spent the next 3 years in Washington. He was very good at his job. He charmed Eleanor Roosevelt at a White House dinner. He charmed Vice President Henry Wallace. He charmed the publisher of the Saturday Evening Post. He charmed essentially every senior figure in the wartime American capital, including, eventually, a young intelligence officer named Ian Fleming, who would become his lifelong friend. He worked, on the side, for British intelligence, gathering political and personal information about the American establishment and feeding it back to London. He had affairs. He drank. He wrote, for the first time, short stories about flying, partly because the writer C.S. Forrester, who had been sent to interview him in 1942 for a propaganda article, had given up and suggested that Roald write the thing himself. Roald did. The result, a piece of cake, was published in the Saturday Evening Post in August of 1942. He was paid $1,000 for it. He had never seen so much money for anything he had done in his life. That was the start. He kept writing through the rest of the war. He wrote stories about flying, about pilots dying, about ghosts in the sky. Walt Disney optioned one of them for a feature-length animated film about gremlins, small green creatures the pilots blamed for mechanical failures, which would have been Disney's first wartime feature. The project fell through. But Roald, by the end of 1943, was a published author with a small but growing reputation as a writer of strange, dark short fiction about pilots and the war. He came home to Britain in 1945. He moved back in with his mother. He spent 2 decades writing dark short fiction for The New Yorker and other American magazines. Stories about poisoned strawberries, gambling addicts, malevolent twin children, and ordinary suburban couples meeting horrifying ends. The collection Kiss Kiss, published in 1960, is still in print. So is Someone Like You. He was a quietly successful adult fiction writer with a small literary reputation. Then in 1961, he wrote a children's book, James and the Giant Peach, for his own 4 children, who had asked for a bedtime story. He published it. It was modestly successful. He wrote another, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, in 1964. It sold 500,000 copies in its first 3 years. Then The Magic Finger, then Fantastic Mr. Fox, then Danny the Champion of the World, then the BFG, then The Witches, then Matilda. By the time he died, in 1990, he was the most beloved children's author writing in English, with combined sales of his children's books in the hundreds of millions. He never talked much about how the children's books connected to the desert crash. He alluded to it in his autobiographical book Going Solo, published in 1986, 4 years before his death. In that book he wrote, in his characteristic plain, calm voice, about the morning of September the 19th, the wrong coordinates, the boulder, the gun sight, and the long walk through the dark. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, with a deceptively simple prose that hid, underneath, an enormous patience for cruelty and a fierce loyalty to the small, brave people of the world. He had been a small, brave person himself, crawling out of a burning biplane with a fractured skull, walking through the dark with no idea whether he would ever be found. A great deal of what he became as a children's author was visible in that boy on the ground in the desert. The understanding that grown-ups could be cruel and stupid. The understanding that children, by themselves, against the dark, could sometimes simply walk. The understanding that the world was strange and beautiful and that survival, often, was a matter of being just slightly more stubborn than the thing trying to kill you. He died at 74 of leukemia, in Oxford, on the 23rd of November 1990. He was buried in the parish churchyard of Great Missenden, in Buckinghamshire, where he had lived for the previous 35 years. The grave is simple. His name, his dates, a small inscription his children chose. In the children's gardens at Great Missenden you can still see the small wooden writing hut where he wrote James and the Giant Peach and the BFG and Matilda, sitting upright in an old chair that had been adapted to support his spine, which had never properly recovered from the day he hit the gun sight at 60 miles an hour in the Libyan desert in 1940. The biplane lies, presumably, somewhere out there still. The wrong coordinates, the unmarked strip, the desert that has shifted 40 more years over its bones. The boy walked away from it once. The rest of his life, in some quiet sense, never quite stopped walking. If the story moved you, there are other men, quiet, brave, forgotten, waiting in the same long line of history. Subscribe to follow the Untold front. New stories every week. In February of 1944, in a freezing officer's hut on a muddy bomber base in Norfolk, England, the most famous movie star in America sat with his head in his hands. He was 35 years old. He had been in the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator for 4.5 hours over German-controlled territory that morning. He had watched 2 aircraft from his own squadron explode in front of his eyes. He had brought what was left of his formation home through low cloud and crosswinds, with one engine on fire and another running rough. He had landed at the wrong base because his own runway was too short for his damaged aircraft. He had drunk a cup of bad coffee, and now he sat in the hut, alone, trying to write the after-action report, and his hands would not stop shaking. He had won the Academy Award for Best Actor 3 years earlier. He had played the lead opposite Katharine Hepburn. He had been on the cover of Life magazine 4 times. Nobody at the base that morning called him James Stewart. They called him the Major, or sometimes, quietly behind his back, Jim, because they knew he hated being called sir by men he commanded who were a decade older than he was. This is the story of how the most famous actor of his generation walked away from Hollywood at the peak of his career, lied his way into the Army Air Corps with a malnutrition diagnosis hanging over him, and flew 20 combat missions as a B-24 bomber pilot over the worst German air defenses of the war. James Maitland Stewart was born on May 20th, 1908, in Indiana, Pennsylvania, a small town in the Allegheny foothills about 60 miles east of Pittsburgh. His father, Alexander Stewart, owned the J.M. Stewart hardware store, which had been in the family since 1853. The Stewarts were Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. Alex Stewart had served in both the Spanish-American War and the First World War. His son grew up in a household where military service was simply what men in the family did when called. Jimmy was a tall, thin, shy boy who stuttered slightly when he was nervous. He worked summers in the hardware store. He played football badly, too thin to take a hit, and ran track. He went east to Messisburg Academy, then to Princeton, where he studied architecture and acted in a few college plays as a hobby. He graduated in 1932 with an architecture degree and the worst possible economy to start a career in. There were no architects being hired in 1932. The next summer, an old Princeton classmate named Joshua Logan invited him to join a summer stock theater company in Massachusetts. Jimmy went, intending to stay for 1 season. He stayed for the rest of his life. By the autumn of 1934, he was on Broadway. By 1935, he was in Hollywood under contract to MGM. By 1939, he had played the lead in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. By 1941, he had won the Academy Award for The Philadelphia Story. That same year, on March the 22nd, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, he was drafted under the Selective Service Act. He failed the Army physical. He weighed 143 pounds on a 6-foot 3-inch frame. He was, the Army doctor wrote, 10 pounds underweight for his height and visibly malnourished. He went back to Hollywood. He went on a deliberate weight gain diet. He drank milkshakes with raw eggs and lifted weights for 6 weeks. He gained 10 pounds. He went back to the draft board. He insisted on being reweighed. He scraped over the minimum by half a pound. He was accepted into the United States Army on March the 22nd, 1941, exactly 1 year to the day from his first failed physical. The Army was, at first, completely uncertain what to do with him. He was a famous actor at the peak of his fame. He was 33 years old, which was old for a recruit. Hollywood lobbied for him to be assigned to the Army Air Corps Motion Picture Unit, where he would make training films and recruitment shorts, a glamorous, safe, public relations job that would allow MGM to keep his face on screen during the war. Jimmy refused. He told his commanding officer he had not put on 10 pounds of milkshake weight to sit behind a camera. He had a pilot's license. He had been flying for fun since 1935 and had logged over 400 hours in single-engine aircraft. He wanted to fly. The Army gave him primary flight training at Moffett Field in California, then advanced multi-engine training in Albuquerque. He soloed in B-17s. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He was then transferred to a B-24 Liberator training base in Boise, Idaho, where he checked out as an aircraft commander on the Liberator, the 4-engine heavy bomber that the 8th Air Force was just beginning to use in large numbers over Germany. For most of 1942 and 1943, despite his repeated requests, the Army kept him stateside. He was promoted from second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain, partly on merit, partly because the Army could not credibly hold back the highest-paid actor in America at lower ranks than men under his command. He flew thousands of hours of training missions. He instructed newer pilots. He grew quietly furious. He requested overseas duty in writing every week. In November of 1943, he finally got it. He was assigned to the 445th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, then forming up for deployment to England. He was given command of the 703rd Bomb Squadron, 16 B-24 Liberators, 120 men. He flew his own aircraft, a B-24H he named Tenevis, from the United States to England, across the North Atlantic in late November 1943. He arrived at Tybenham Airfield in Norfolk on the 23rd of November, 4 days before Thanksgiving. The 8th Air Force in late 1943 was being torn to pieces. The American Daylight Bombing Campaign, the doctrine that B-17s and B-24s flying in mass formation could defend themselves against German fighters without escorts, had been brutally disproved at Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and a dozen other targets earlier in the year. Loss rates on deep penetration missions were running at 10% per mission. The P-51 Mustang escort fighter, which would eventually solve the problem, was just beginning to arrive in significant numbers. The bomber crews flying in the winter of 1943 to 1944 were dying at a rate that made the parachute infantry look safe. Jimmy's first mission was on December the 13th, 1943, a 996 bomber raid on the U-boat pens at Kiel. He flew as deputy lead of the 703rd Squadron. The mission was a hard one: fighter opposition, flak, 8 hours of formation flying in sub-zero temperatures at 23,000 feet, with the cabin unheated and oxygen masks on the entire time. 2 of his squadron's aircraft were shot down. He brought the rest home. He landed Tenevis at Tybenham, taxied to the dispersal pan, climbed out of the cockpit and threw up on the tarmac. He went straight to his quarters and slept for 14 hours. He flew his second mission 3 days later, to Bremen. Over the next 3 months, he flew 12 more missions as squadron leader. To Ludwigshafen, to Frankfurt, to Brunswick, to Berlin, to the German submarine bases at Bremen and Kiel again. On most of those missions he flew as command pilot in the lead aircraft, meaning his own bomber was the bullseye for every German fighter and every flak gun that wanted to disrupt the formation. He was a meticulous, almost obsessive squadron commander. He briefed his crews longer than anyone else in the wing. He went over every detail of the route. He insisted on calling each man by name. He talked to his gunners individually before takeoff. He read every after-action report personally. He wrote letters home to the families of every man he lost. In an 8th Air Force unit that, on bad weeks, lost 10 or 12 men, this took up most of his evenings. He was seen, on more than one occasion, weeping at his desk while typing such letters. In March of 1944, he was promoted to operations officer of the 453rd Bomb Group, a new unit at Old Buckenham, Norfolk, just down the road from Tybenham. The 453rd was in trouble. The first commanding officer had been killed in action. The second had cracked under pressure. Morale was rock bottom. Crews were refusing to fly. Junior officers were drinking themselves out of combat. Jimmy was sent over as the operations officer specifically to fix the unit, on the theory that his calm Pennsylvania reserve and his obvious moral seriousness would steady the men in a way that another regular Air Corps officer might not. It worked slowly. He flew with the worst-performing crews himself. He took them on shorter, easier missions first, to the V-1 launch sites on the French coast, before sending them back to the deep penetration targets in Germany. He moved into the same quarters as the enlisted men's barracks for 2 weeks, against regulations, to find out what they were being fed and why morale was so low. He had the mess officer replaced. He had the bombing patterns of the lead aircraft redrawn so that crews could see, on the after-action photographs, exactly where their bombs had fallen. He restored, slowly, the unit's sense of its own competence. By June 1944, D-Day month, the 453rd was one of the highest-performing bomb groups in the 8th Air Force, with one of the lowest loss rates and the most consistent bomb pattern density. The unit credited that turnaround, almost entirely, to one nervous, soft-spoken, 6'3" actor who would not let them feel sorry for themselves. He flew his 20th and final combat mission on July 7, 1944, a raid on Bernburg, in central Germany. He was 36 years old, exhausted, and visibly losing weight again. The 8th Air Force, recognizing both the man's physical condition and the political fact that the most famous actor in America could not be allowed to be killed by a German flak burst over Berlin, took him off operational flying that week. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and made chief of staff of the 2nd Combat Bombardment Wing. He flew for the rest of the war only in command capacity, observing missions, never leading the bombing run himself. He never publicly admitted to flying more combat missions than the official 20. Air Force records, declassified in the 1990s, show that he flew at least 4 more uncounted missions as observer in command during the autumn of 1944, missions on which the lead aircraft was a target every bit as much as on his official sorties. He never accepted credit for them. He was promoted to full colonel in March 1945. He was, at war's end, one of the most senior combat officers in the 8th Air Force, and the only Hollywood star who had flown an entire tour of combat in the European theater. He came home in August 1945. He was 40 pounds underweight. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He had developed a chronic stomach ulcer. He stood in his parents' hardware store in Indiana, Pennsylvania, on the morning of his return, for almost 2 hours before he could bring himself to speak. His father did not press him. The two men, eventually, simply hugged each other for a long time. Alex Stewart, who had served in 2 previous wars, would later tell Jimmy's mother that he had never seen any soldier come home looking the way his son had. Jimmy did not act for almost a year. He gave one famous interview to Look magazine in late 1945 in which he said quietly that he did not know whether he could still be a movie star because he no longer understood what was important about acting. The studio executives, terrified, were patient with him. He eventually agreed to do one picture in late 1946 for the director Frank Capra. The picture was called It's a Wonderful Life. The film was a financial disappointment when it was released. Audiences in late 1946 were tired of sentimental holiday pictures. Critics were lukewarm. It would not become the Christmas classic it is today for another 25 years, when it fell out of copyright protection in 1974 and began airing on American television every December. In the central performance of the film, George Bailey, small-town banker, dreamer, failed suicide, husband and father, is the same age Jimmy himself was. The collapse George Bailey suffers in the 3rd act of the picture, the panic on the bridge, the tears in the snow, the moment when he begs to be allowed to live again, was widely remarked at the time as the most emotionally raw performance American audiences had ever seen Stewart give. Almost no one knew, in 1946, that Jimmy was drawing directly on his own collapse in those frozen Norfolk evenings in the winter of 1944. The crying scene was filmed in a single take. Capra reportedly cut the camera early because he could not bear to keep filming. Jimmy was inconsolable for 45 minutes afterward. He never spoke publicly while he lived about the connection between the role and the war. He refused, for the rest of his life, to give interviews about his combat flying. He would talk about training, about the technical details of the B-24, about administrative matters. He would not talk about the missions. He would not talk about the men he had lost. He kept his Distinguished Flying Cross and his Air Medal in a small box in his Beverly Hills office. He showed them, in old age, only to a handful of people. He continued flying. He stayed in the Air Force Reserve. He was promoted to Brigadier General in 1959, the highest-ranking actor ever to serve in the United States military. He flew B-52 missions over Vietnam as an observer in 1966. He retired from the Air Force in 1968 after 27 years of service. He kept making movies, Anatomy of a Murder, Vertigo, Rear Window, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, into his 70s. He married late, at 41, a war widow named Gloria Hattrick McLean, whose first husband had been killed flying a P-38 over Holland. They had twin daughters. He adopted Gloria's 2 sons from her first marriage. He was a famously devoted father. He took his stepsons to the graves of P-38 pilots in the Netherlands when they were old enough to ask. He died on July 2, 1997, at the age of 89, in his home in Beverly Hills. He was buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park. His grave has the simplest possible marker, his name, his dates, and the single-line Colonel, United States Air Force, World War II. There is a small museum in Indiana, Pennsylvania, in the building where the J.M. Stewart hardware store once stood. There is a B-24 Liberator at the Strategic Air Command Museum in Nebraska bearing the markings of Tenevis. There is a Distinguished Flying Cross on a velvet cushion at the Air Force Academy. And every December, on television sets across the United States, a small-town banker on a snowy bridge weeps and prays to be allowed to live, in a single unbroken take filmed by a director who had to cut early because he could not bear to keep watching. The man playing him had flown 20 real missions to ask the same question. He had come home unable to talk about it. He had, in his way, kept asking the question for the rest of his life. If the story moved you, there are other men, quiet, brave, forgotten, waiting in the same long line of history. Subscribe to follow the Untold front. New stories every week. On a clear morning in April 1945, near a small town on the Polish-German border, a U.S. Army officer at a temporary repatriation camp looked up from his desk and saw a tall, blond, exhausted young man in a Soviet Army uniform standing in front of him. The man was carrying a Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun. He had a German pistol in his belt. He had not shaved in 2 weeks. He was speaking, however, in fluent English with a flat Midwestern accent. He explained that his name was Joseph R. Beyrle of Muskegon, Michigan, that he was a paratrooper in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, that he had been killed in action on the night of June 6, 1944, according to a War Department telegram his mother had received the previous summer, and that he would now like to go home. The officer asked him to take a seat. Then he picked up the telephone and made a long-distance call to Washington. This is the story of the only known American soldier of the Second World War who fought, in uniform, for both the United States Army and the Red Army of the Soviet Union, escaped from 7 different German prisoner-of-war camps, was officially listed as dead for 10 months by his own government, and came home to bury himself in his own grave. Joseph Robert Beyrle was born on August 25, 1923, in Muskegon, Michigan, an old lumber town on the shore of Lake Michigan. His parents were William and Elizabeth Beyrle. His father worked at the Continental Motors plant during the long boom of the 20s and was laid off, with most of his Catholic working-class neighborhood, when the Depression closed the factory gates in 1931. The family went on relief. They lost the small house on Sumner Avenue. They moved into a series of rented rooms. Joe, the third of 7 children, learned to share a single pair of shoes with his older brother for school. He grew up tall, quick, and good at every sport his school could put a team together for. He was a star quarterback at St. Joseph's High School, a state-level shot putter, and a competitive swimmer. He was offered an athletic scholarship to the University of Notre Dame in his senior year. He turned it down. The war was on. His older brother was already in uniform. In June of 1942, 2 weeks after his graduation from St. Joseph's, Joe walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office in Muskegon and was rejected for slightly flat feet. He walked across the street to the Army office and was accepted on the spot. He chose airborne because he wanted, he later said, to be in the most demanding outfit the Army had. He trained at Camp Toccoa in Georgia, then at Fort Benning where he made his first jumps. He was assigned to Company I, 3rd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the regiment that would later become famous as the Band of Brothers, although Joe was not in easy company. He was a demolition specialist, trained to carry, set, and detonate the small charges that paratroopers used to blow up bridges, railroad tracks, and German communication lines behind the lines. In September of 1943, the 506th was shipped to England. They trained for the next 9 months at Aldbourne in Wiltshire, conducting jumps over the Salisbury Plain by night and learning, in painstaking detail, the routes they would take after they dropped into occupied France. Joe was sent on 2 pre-D-Day intelligence missions into German-held Normandy, both times jumping in alone by parachute with a satchel of gold coins to bribe French resistance contacts, and walking out across the lines after delivering the coins. Both missions succeeded. Both were classified for the next 40 years. He was 20 years old. On the night of June 5, 1944, Joe boarded a C-47 transport at North Witham Airfield in Lincolnshire. The 506th's job that night was to drop into Normandy several hours ahead of the seaborne invasion, seize key crossroads and bridges in the area around Corentin, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Joe's specific mission was to blow up a power station near the village of Saint-Cum-du-Mont. The drop went badly. The C-47 carrying Joe's stick of paratroopers was hit by German anti-aircraft fire on the run-in. The pilot lost control momentarily, the green jump light flashed early, and Joe went out the door at perhaps 300 feet over the church steeple of Saint-Cum-du-Mont, far below the minimum safe altitude for a parachute to fully open. His chute opened just in time. He landed hard on the slate roof of the church itself, rolled off, hit the ground in the church graveyard, and lay still for several minutes recovering from the impact. He freed himself from his harness. He gathered his weapons, a Thompson submachine gun, a Colt 1911 pistol, 6 fragmentation grenades, and his demolition satchel. He moved out across the dark Norman countryside in the direction of his target. He was, by this point, separated from every other man in his stick. He walked alone for almost 2 hours through hedgerows and apple orchards. He found the power station. He set his charges. He detonated them. The power station went up. He was confirmed by other 506th men who heard the explosion from their own positions as the man who had taken it out. Then, while withdrawing through a small lane on the outskirts of the village, he ran straight into a German machine gun position he had not known was there. The first burst of MG-42 fire passed over his head. The second burst pinned him in a ditch. He had no clear shot at the gunner. He had no support. He was alone in the dark. After a standoff of perhaps 15 minutes, with German infantry closing in on his ditch from both sides, he made the only decision he could. He stood up with his hands above his head. That was June the 6th. He spent the next 10 months as a prisoner of war. But that's only the start of what he did with that captivity. He was taken first to a temporary collection point near Corentin. The Germans had him for less than a day before he escaped. He slipped over the wall of the holding pen at night, made it half a kilometer into the bocage, and was recaptured by a German patrol at dawn. They beat him with rifle butts and threw him in a barn. 2 days later he escaped again, this time with 3 other Americans, by working loose a board in the wall. They were caught within 12 hours. The Germans, increasingly unimpressed, shipped him east. He was processed through Stalag XIIA at Limburg and Durlan, then onward to Stalag 3C at Altdruitz, deep in eastern Germany, near the Polish border. He arrived there in late July 1944. Stalag 3C was a brutal camp. The food was rotten cabbage soup twice a day and a few hundred grams of black bread. The Russians in the eastern compound were dying of starvation and typhus at the rate of a dozen a week. The Americans were treated slightly better, but only slightly. Joe weighed 175 pounds when he was captured. By Christmas 1944, he weighed 130. In the meantime, the War Department in Washington had received an incorrect report. A German patrol had found a body in Saint-Cum-du-Mont on June the 7th, an American paratrooper whose dog tags had been taken by another soldier, possibly to confuse the Germans, possibly looted. The body was buried hastily and a tag with Joe's name on it was forwarded to American Graves Registration. A telegram went out to his mother in Muskegon on August 17, 1944. Elizabeth Beyrle read it standing in her kitchen. Her son was officially killed in action. There was a funeral mass at St. Mary's Church on Sumner Avenue. Joe's name was carved into the parish memorial. His grave was dug in the Beyrle family plot at the local cemetery. There was a small stone with his name and dates on it. His mother visited it every Sunday for the next 10 months. Joe, 1,800 miles east, did not know any of this had happened. In January of 1945, with the Red Army's massive winter offensive smashing west across Poland toward the German border, Stalag 3C was suddenly within 20 miles of the front. On the night of January the 8th, Joe and 2 other American prisoners, Brewer and Quinn, made another escape attempt. They cut through the wire on the eastern fence, crossed a frozen creek, and walked east through the snow toward what they hoped would be the advancing Russians. They walked for 3 days. Brewer fell behind. Quinn was killed by a German cavalry patrol that ambushed them on the second night. Joe kept walking. On the 4th day, near the Polish town of Wrocław, he saw a column of Russian T-34 tanks moving west along a road through the pine forest. He stood up out of the ditch he was hiding in, put his hands above his head, and shouted at them in the few words of Russian he had learned from the eastern compound at Stalag 3C. Amerikansky Tovarish. The Russian tank commander, a woman as it happened, a senior lieutenant named Alexandra Petrovna Samosenko, one of the very few women commanding T-34s in the war, climbed down from her turret, looked Joe up and down, listened to his explanation, and decided to take him along. What happened next is the part of the story that does not appear in any American history textbook. Joe asked Samosenko if he could fight with her unit. He explained, in his halting Russian and her halting English, that he had no way to get back to American lines, that he wanted to keep fighting, and that he had specialist experience in demolitions. Samosenko thought it over for an hour. Then she gave him a Soviet Army uniform jacket, a fur cap, a PPSH-41 submachine gun, and a place on the back deck of her command tank. For the next 3 weeks, Joe Beyrle fought as an unofficial member of the 2nd Tank Battalion of the 1st Guards Tank Army, attached to Samosenko's vehicle. They fought their way west across Poland, through small villages and pine forests, with the German rearguard collapsing in front of them. Joe blew up bridges. He demolished German communication lines. He spotted concealed anti-tank positions for the Russian tanks. He was wounded slightly, a fragment in the leg from a German potato masher grenade, and treated at a Russian field hospital where Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself, visiting the front to inspect the rate of advance, came through the wards and spotted the strange American among the wounded Soviets. Zhukov questioned Joe through an interpreter for half an hour. He gave him a signed letter on the spot, authorizing him to be transported through Soviet lines to the American embassy in Moscow. Joe carried that letter for the next 6 weeks. He recovered from his wound. He was sent east by train to Warsaw, then to the small town near the old Polish-German border where the American repatriation officer would, in April 1945, look up from his desk and see him standing in his Soviet uniform. From the repatriation camp, he was sent to Moscow. The American embassy received him cautiously. The State Department was suspicious. Soldiers did not, as a rule, fight for foreign armies, and the Cold War was already beginning to chill the diplomatic air between Washington and Moscow. Joe spent 5 weeks in Moscow being debriefed. Zhukov's letter helped. So did the affidavits the Russians provided. Eventually, the State Department concluded that Joe was who he said he was, that his service with the Red Army had been a unique and unrepeatable accident of the Eastern Front collapse, and that he was entitled to be sent home as a recovering American POW. He sailed from Odessa in early May 1945. He landed in Boston on April the 21st, on the 21st of May. He took a train west. He arrived in Muskegon at the end of May 1945, more than 10 months after his mother had received the telegram informing her of his death. He walked from the train station to St. Mary's parish house. The pastor, Father Beyrle, who had said the funeral mass the previous August, did not at first recognize him. When Father Beyrle did recognize him, he said nothing for a full minute. Then he picked up the telephone and called Elizabeth Beyrle. She was making bread. The flour was still on her hands when she opened the door of the parish house. She looked at her son. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Joseph." Then she sat down on the steps. That night the whole family went together to the cemetery. Joe stood beside his own grave. He read the small stone with his name on it. He said it felt, he later told his children, exactly the way it sounded, both extremely strange and oddly comforting. He stayed in the army for a few months, was honorably discharged in November 1945, and went to work for the Brunswick bowling pin factory in Muskegon. He married a young woman named Joanne in 1946. They had 3 children. He worked as a foreman, then a plant supervisor, then a manager. He coached Little League. He never talked much about either war he had fought in. His children grew up knowing only the outline. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the Russian and American presidents, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, jointly invited Joe Beyrle to the Rose Garden of the White House. They presented him with a medal from each country: the American Bronze Star, which he had earned at Saint-Cum-du-Mont in 1944, and a Soviet medal for his service with the 1st Guards Tank Army in 1945. The 2 presidents, in the middle of a difficult period of post-Cold War diplomacy, held him up as a small living symbol that the 2 armies had once fought on the same side, against the same enemy, for the same things. Joe's son, John Beyrle, who was at the ceremony as a young State Department officer, would go on to serve as the United States ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2008 to 2012. He represented the country his father had fought for, in the country his father had also fought for, at a moment when the 2 had never quite stopped being uneasy with each other. Joe Beyrle died in 2004 at the age of 80 while visiting Camp Toccoa in Georgia, the same place he had trained as a young paratrooper 62 years earlier. He had a heart attack in his sleep at the small motel where he was staying for a 506th reunion. He was buried, this time for keeps, at Arlington National Cemetery. There is a small museum at the Brunswick plant in Muskegon. There is a high school scholarship at St. Joseph's in his name. There is a plaque on the church wall at Saint-Cum-du-Mont. There is a stone at the Russian War Memorial at Volgograd that lists him among the foreign volunteers who served under Marshal Zhukov in the Great Drive West. And there is a single small stone still standing in the Beyrle family plot in Muskegon, with his name on it and his date of birth, and no date of death, because there was never any need to carve one. He had already, in a way, come back from his own grave once. If the story moved you, there are other men, quiet, brave, forgotten, waiting in the same long line of history. Subscribe to follow the Untold front. New stories every week. They were still 200 yards from the beach when the ramp dropped. The men in front went into water over their heads and didn't come up. The men behind them stepped out after them anyway, because the ramp was down and the Germans were firing and there was nowhere else to go except forward, through water that was already turning red, toward a beach that offered no cover, toward bluffs from which machine guns were firing with the methodical efficiency of a factory. This was Omaha Beach. June 6, 1944. 6:30 in the morning. Steven Spielberg's film begins here, and nothing in cinema has captured those first minutes more accurately. But a film is 2 hours. The real day was 24 hours. And inside the chaos of that day were individual stories of men doing things so extraordinary that they defined the outcome of the entire war. This is the story of the real soldiers of D-Day. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, was the largest amphibious assault in history. It would involve nearly 7,000 vessels, 12,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men crossing the English Channel in a single day to storm a heavily defended coastline. The planning had taken years and consumed some of the finest military minds the Allies possessed. The deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, had convinced the Germans that the real invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy, and Hitler's insistence on holding his panzer reserves back from the beaches on D-Day reflected this deception's success. But plans and deception could only do so much. On Omaha Beach, a 5-mile crescent of sand below 100-foot bluffs, assigned to the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The preliminary naval and aerial bombardment missed the German defensive positions entirely, most of it overshooting into farmland behind the bluffs. The specialized tanks designed to support the infantry were launched too far offshore and most sank before they reached the beach. The landing craft drifted east, dropping units into the wrong positions. And the German division defending Omaha, the 352nd Infantry, was a battle-hardened unit that American intelligence hadn't known was there. By 8 in the morning, the assault on Omaha Beach was failing. The film focuses on Army Rangers. This is accurate. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had been assigned to one of the most critical missions of the entire invasion, Point du Hoc. Point du Hoc is a promontory of rock projecting into the channel between Omaha and Utah beaches, rising about 100 feet above the waterline in sheer chalk cliffs. Allied aerial reconnaissance had identified a battery of 6 155mm guns at its summit guns that could destroy the invasion fleet. The Rangers were ordered to climb the cliffs under fire, take the battery, and destroy the guns before they could be used. Colonel James Earl Rudder commanded the 2nd Rangers at Point du Hoc. He was 34 years old, from Texas, a former football coach who had gotten into the Army by faking his age. He was also, by most accounts, one of the finest small unit commanders in the American Army. When the landing craft touched the base of the cliffs at 7:08 in the morning, more than 40 minutes late, after a navigation error had taken them along the French coast under fire, Rudder's men fired rocket grapnels up the cliff face and began to climb. Germans cut ropes. Rangers fell. Others grabbed the next rope and kept going. Within minutes, not the 30 or 40 that planners had estimated, the 1st Rangers were at the top. They fought hand-to-hand through the positions at the summit of the cliff. They found the gun positions empty. The guns themselves had been moved inland. Following tire tracks and telephone wire through the fields behind the promontory, a patrol of Rangers found the guns concealed in an orchard 200 meters from the road. They destroyed them with thermite grenades. The mission was accomplished. Point du Hoc was taken, but the Rangers at the top of the cliff were surrounded, cut off from reinforcement, and under repeated counterattack. Of the 225 men who had scaled the cliff, only 90 were still able to fight after 2 days of holding the position. They held it until the main American advance reached them. The first man to reach the top of Point du Hoc was not in the film. His name was Sergeant Len Lommel. When the patrol found the guns in the orchard, it was Lommel who carried the thermite grenades and destroyed 2 of them before his supply ran out, then sent his partner Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn back for more to finish the job. He was 24 years old. On Omaha Beach, by mid-morning, the situation was critical. Dead and wounded lay at the waterline where the tide was pushing them. Survivors crouched behind the few obstacles that offered cover. Concrete blocks, iron hedgehogs, the bodies of the fallen. German machine guns in concrete emplacements raked the beach systematically. Brigadier General Norman Cota arrived on the beach at around 7:30 and walked through the fire upright, which was either extraordinary leadership or recklessness. The line between these things in combat is often the outcome. He is the template for the character Tom Hanks plays, the combat leader who holds the thing together when it's falling apart. Cota found Rangers pinned behind a seawall and reportedly said, "Rangers, lead the way," the line that became the official motto of the Ranger Regiment. Whether the exact phrase was said exactly there is debated by historians. What is not debated is what Cota did. He moved through the beach, identified gaps in the German wire, pushed men through them, organized the first assault on the bluffs, and turned what was close to a disaster into a breakthrough. By afternoon, American soldiers were on top of the bluffs. The cost was roughly 2,000 American casualties on Omaha Beach on June 6 alone. The exact number is still debated. The records are incomplete because of the chaos of the day. Some estimates put it higher. The premise of the film, pulling a soldier from the front to bring him home because his brothers have been killed, is based on a real story. The Nyland brothers were 4 sons from Tonawanda, New York: Frederick, Edward, Preston, and Robert. On D-Day, Robert Nyland was killed at Utah Beach with the 82nd Airborne. On the same day, Preston Nyland was killed in Burma. Edward Nyland, who had been missing, was believed dead. He was actually a prisoner of war in Japan, a fact his family didn't know. That left Frederick, Fritz, as the apparent sole survivor of 4 brothers who had all entered service. An army chaplain named Father Francis Sampson tracked down Fritz's regiment and passed the information up the chain. Fritz was found, pulled from the line, and sent home. The actual encounter was less dramatic than the film. There was no sustained combat mission to reach Fritz. His company commander informed him he was being sent back. He argued against it briefly, was overruled, and left. He returned home to Tonawanda. He attended the reunion when Edward turned up alive after the war. He outlived everyone. He died in 1999, the same year Saving Private Ryan was released. Spielberg's film is not a documentary. Characters are composites. The plot is invented. The specific mission, a squad crossing Normandy to find one man, did not happen in anything like the form shown. But the texture of the film is accurate in ways that matter. The sound design was drawn from veterans' accounts. The tactics, the way units moved, communicated, processed casualties, were researched from military records. The German defensive positions, the hedgerow fighting, the equipment, the attention to period accuracy is significant. Most importantly, the first 27 minutes, the Omaha Beach sequence, was reviewed by actual veterans and military historians as the most accurate cinematic depiction of that specific experience ever committed to film. Veterans who had been there said they couldn't watch it. That is a specific kind of accuracy. What the film cannot show, what no film can, is the accumulation. 2,000 men on one beach on one day. 6,000 Allied dead in a day. 156,000 men crossing a channel, most of them knowing some significant percentage of them would not come back. The real D-Day was not the story of one squad. It was the simultaneous story of 100,000 individual acts, of men who were afraid and went anyway, who were hit and kept moving, who went back for their friend when going back meant almost certain death. Normandy today has 41 cemeteries and memorials, containing the graves of soldiers from 14 nations. The American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, above Omaha Beach, contains 9,387 graves arranged in perfect rows facing west toward home. Among them are men who died before they reached the beach, men who died on the sand, men who made it to the top of the bluffs and died the next day or the day after that in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy. And among them, somewhere in the record, are the names that became the composites of the men in the film: the Rangers of the 2nd Battalion, the soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, the men of the Nyland family and the 10,000 families like them. The film exists. The graves exist too. Both are worth visiting. But it is the graves that tell the true story. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. Imagine being briefed by a general who is not wearing a shirt, who is, in fact, wearing nothing at all, sitting cross-legged on a cot in a tent in the Burmese heat, reading from maps spread across his naked lap, occasionally eating raw onions from a bag, occasionally brushing his teeth while he talks. His personal hygiene having never settled on a consistent schedule. This is how several of Orde Wingate's officers described their first meeting with him in the jungle camps of India in 1943. This is also, they would discover, not the strangest thing about him. The strangest thing about Orde Wingate was that he was right. Orde Charles Wingate was born on the 26th of February, 1903, in Nainital, India, where his father was serving in the Indian Army. His parents were Plymouth Brethren, a strict, evangelical Protestant sect, fiercely Old Testament, deeply suspicious of worldly ambition and material comfort. The Bible was read aloud every night. Prayers were long. The faith was total. Wingate absorbed this completely and spent his entire adult life in a relationship with the Old Testament that most people in the British Army found difficult to understand. He thought of himself, without apparent irony, as an instrument of divine purpose. He chose his campaigns partly by their resonance with biblical narrative. He named his Ethiopian operations after Gideon. He saw the formation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine not as a political question but as the fulfillment of Scripture. His superiors, across a 20-year career, tended to regard this as either visionary or insane. often both simultaneously. His first significant posting was to Palestine in 1936, where the Arab revolt had made British administration of the Mandate increasingly dangerous. Arab guerrilla groups were attacking Jewish settlements and British installations throughout the territory. The conventional military response, patrols, checkpoints, reactive policing, was demonstrably failing. Wingate proposed something different. He organized what he called special night squads. Small mixed units of British soldiers and Jewish Haganah fighters, operating after dark in the areas where the Arab attacks originated, using aggressive surprise tactics to disrupt the enemy's operational patterns rather than simply responding to incidents after they happened. The special night squads worked. They reduced attacks significantly in their operational areas. They also made Wingate enormously controversial. The Jewish leaders of Palestine, Moshe Dayan, David Ben-Gurion, regarded him as a prophet and a friend. The British High Command regarded his close relationship with the Haganah as politically problematic and his independence from standard doctrine as professionally dangerous. He was recalled to Britain in 1939, forbidden to return to Palestine, and placed under a kind of informal watchfulness. He attempted, while in London, to write a paper arguing for the creation of a Jewish state, and circulated it to people he thought might listen. He was told formally to stop. He did not stop. He simply moved on to the next thing the war put in front of him. The next thing was Ethiopia. Italy had occupied Ethiopia since 1935, expelling the Emperor Haile Selassie. When Italy entered the war on Germany's side in 1940, the British resolved to help Selassie reclaim his country. The problem was resources. Britain was stretched thin across every front. There were not enough troops, not enough equipment, not enough time to mount the kind of conventional campaign that retaking a country normally required. Wingate was given command of a force he called Gideon Force. Approximately 1,700 British and Ethiopian soldiers, plus Selassie himself, who moved with the column. Against an Italian garrison that, at its peak, numbered around 360,000 men. Gideon Force reclaimed Ethiopia in 5 months. Wingate did it through relentless mobility, aggressive psychological warfare, and the deliberate cultivation of the impression that his force was much larger than it was. He moved his column at night, struck isolated Italian outposts before they could reinforce, and captured Italian officers and used them to broadcast, correctly, that the emperor himself was in the field against them, which destroyed the collaborator government's claim to legitimacy. When Haile Selassie re-entered Addis Ababa in triumph in May 1941, Wingate rode beside him. The conventional military response to Wingate's success was, essentially, to ignore it. The Ethiopian campaign was seen as a sideshow. The unconventional methods were filed away without interest. Wingate, predictably, was not filed away. He collapsed physically and emotionally after Ethiopia. He had driven himself past exhaustion through the campaign and into a depression that the medical records describe carefully and his personal letters describe with a raw honesty that makes difficult reading. In the summer of 1941, in a Cairo hotel room, he attempted to take his own life. He was found. He recovered. He was sent back to Britain. And then, in 1942, with the war in the Pacific going catastrophically wrong, he was sent to India. The Burma campaign was a disaster. The Japanese had moved through the peninsula with a speed and a jungle fighting ability that the British had not believed possible. By the spring of 1942, Burma was lost. The British Indian Army had retreated into India, exhausted and demoralized. The conventional military assessment was that the jungle was the Japanese Army's greatest weapon. Western soldiers could not operate effectively in it. Logistics made sustained offensive action impossible. The terrain gave every advantage to the defense. Wingate arrived in India and disagreed with all of this. He proposed what he called long-range penetration. Small columns of soldiers operating deep behind Japanese lines, supplied entirely by air, cutting Japanese communications and supply routes, and forcing the Japanese to divert forces to deal with them rather than directing those forces against the main front. The key innovation was air supply. If soldiers could be kept alive and armed by aircraft drops, they did not need the long, fixed supply lines that conventional operations required. They could move faster than the enemy expected. They could go where the enemy did not expect them. The technology existed. The aircraft existed. What had never been tested was whether you could actually sustain a fighting force for weeks and months from the air, in dense jungle deep inside enemy territory. Operation Longcloth, launched in February 1943, was the test. 3,000 men crossed the Chindwin River into Burma. They were organized into columns of roughly 400 men each column self-contained, each supplied by airdrops coordinated by radio. They marched over 1,000 miles through the jungle. They cut the Mandalay-Myakina Railway at multiple points, disrupting Japanese supply lines. They fought dozens of engagements, some small, some serious. They demonstrated, repeatedly, that Western soldiers could operate and fight effectively in the Burmese jungle if they were trained, disciplined, and led. The operational results were mixed. Of 3,000 men who crossed the Chindwin, only 1,800 returned. Of those, only 600 were fit for further action. The railway cuts were repaired within weeks by Japanese engineers. The direct military impact was limited, but the strategic impact was enormous. The campaign proved something that the pessimists had insisted was impossible. And proof in war changes what commanders are willing to try. Churchill was electrified. He brought Wingate to the Quebec Conference in August 1943, a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt and their senior advisors, and had Wingate brief the Allied leadership directly. Roosevelt was apparently impressed. Wingate was authorized to expand his force dramatically. Operation Thursday, launched in March 1944, was an order of magnitude larger than Longcloth. 20,000 Chindit soldiers were to be inserted deep behind Japanese lines, not by marching but by glider. Multiple brigades would be landed at jungle clearings, establish fortified strongholds, and conduct long-range operations from bases supplied entirely by air. It was audacious. Some of Wingate's colleagues thought it was madness. The American Air Commander, General Hap Arnold, lent the operation his full support, giving Wingate access to a specially formed air commando unit that could conduct the glider landings and maintain supply. The operation began on the night of the 5th of March, 1944. The gliders landed. The strongholds were established. The columns moved out. Orde Wingate died on the 24th of March, 1944. He had been flying from one forward base to another in a B-25 Mitchell bomber when it crashed into the Naga Hills near Imphal, apparently in turbulent weather and poor visibility. There were no survivors. He was 41 years old. He had been in Burma for 10 days. The operation he had spent 2 years designing and arguing for and forcing through every institutional resistance was only just beginning. Operation Thursday continued without him. The Chindits fought in Burma through the summer of 1944, making significant contributions to the campaign that ultimately broke the Japanese advance into India at Kohima and Imphal. Whether the Chindits, as eventually deployed, represented Wingate's vision faithfully is disputed by military historians. Whether Wingate himself would have adapted his tactics as circumstances changed, as any good commander must, we cannot know. What we know is that the doctrine he developed and demonstrated, at the cost of his own health and the lives of many of his men, changed the way Western armies thought about unconventional warfare. The Israeli Defense Forces trace a direct lineage from Wingate's Special Night Squads in Palestine. The senior IDF officers who fought in Israel's War of Independence in 1948 were, many of them, men Wingate had trained, disciplined, and inspired. They called him Hayedid, the friend. There is a forest named for him in Israel. There is a memorial at the entrance to the National Military School. In Britain, his legacy is more complicated. The establishment he spent his career fighting remained ambivalent about him. His unconventional personality, his religious intensity, his contempt for standard doctrine and standard authority. None of these made him easy to commemorate. But Special Forces, the Special Air Service, the American Rangers, every long-range penetration unit that has operated since the 1940s, operate on principles that Wingate worked out in a jungle in Burma at enormous cost and demonstrated at even greater cost. He was difficult. He was sometimes impossible. He was often right. He died before he saw what he had started. But the Chindits who marched back through the jungle, the columns supplied by air dropping through the tree canopy, the radio operators calling in resupply over mountains and rivers and enemy territory, they knew what they were doing. They were testing an idea. They were proving it. They were changing how wars would be fought for the rest of the century. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.